Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video we're going to be looking at how to paint the hood of Mortarion, primarch of the Death Guard. And you can see on the screen there I've already primed it black and filled in any gaps from sticking it together. And there's my ring because I've just got married. I'm not sure what that's doing on the video. So anyway, the model was stuck together and I basically just used polystyrene cement in the gaps and then sanded it down to get a smooth surface. So because otherwise you'd have a gap in between where the front of the hood connects to the back, in between the spikes that come out of the top of his head. So starting with on the video, if you look in the top left, you can see on the wet palette there are 4 paints there. Well, actually there are only 3 paints from pots. One of them is a mixed colour. So there is German Grey from Vallejo in the top right. There is Temple Guard Blue in the top left. And bottom left is Morrow White from P3, and bottom right is Temple Guard Blue mixed 50-50 with Morrow White. And so just starting, I am going straight with Temple Guard Blue and kind of scrubbing it on the model. It's an older paintbrush I'm using. Don't use your newest brushes. You're likely to wear them out quite quickly doing this kind of thing because you're just being very rough with it. If you'll notice as well, I swap between 2 colours consistently while doing this. So that's between the German Grey and the Temple Guard Blue. So this gives me kind of like a quick blended look, and it also makes the Temple Guard Blue more grey in places as well. We're going to use other colours later on as the texture progresses, but this is just to get all the base work down. Yeah, so you just kind of very roughly scrunch the paint on there. The blue will be worked in more as well, but this is also, when applying it, I'm focusing more on the edges of things, and also you see the kind of tendrils that go down from the edge of the hood. Those will be much lighter at the end. Now there's 2 reasons for that. One is because I want to show it to be more weathered than the top of the hood, but also to create a bit of interesting contrast. So when the head is actually glued onto the body, because his whole cape will be with the same technique as this, then the tips of these hood tendrils will stand out against the darker colour of the material. But even though it's painted in the same technique. So I'm also looking at all the edges of things. They'll need to be lighter as well. Well, you'll see as it progresses where areas are lighter and darker and things like that. It's not that easy to see at the moment. I mean, you can tell there where I've just applied it a lot more grey, just around the edge of the hood. Also, there's going to be quite a lot of glazing on top of this with other colours, not just black, although black will be involved, but I'm going to put some red on. So it's going to be quite similar to how I did the Greater Demon of Nurgle, but when I did the video for the Greater Demon of Nurgle, I actually added the red and blues after I'd already done the video for doing the leather hood on him. So although you see how to do the leather hood, the final result that I did actually looks different to the video. So in this video you'll actually see how to achieve that same look, so you can apply this obviously to other models as well. But yeah, it's just a case of using these 2 colours at the moment and scrunching them on. What you'll find is, particularly with the Temple Guard Blue, because you're going over a black base, it won't give very hard marks. It'll be quite transparent. It is a layer paint as well. So you won't get super hard marks with it. Of course, you don't want that too much, although so we're going to be using lots of layers anyway. So you're getting a bit of texture down with this kind of rough painting technique, but then there are going to be more layers on top, which will add extra texture. But the texture will become more and more refined as we go along, becoming much smaller and finer. So now that I've covered the whole of the hood with the Temple Guard Blue and the German Grey mixture, and I say mixture, but it wasn't. It is mixed on the model rather than mixed on the palette. But now I'm using more pure Temple Guard Blue, just to pick out the areas that I think should be lighter and will be more weathered. But it's kind of like just another layer again. You can see that I'm doing the same sort of technique where it's all very roughly applied. And the way the paint is applied is quite specific in that I want it to look rough and kind of random. So as the layers progress, it'll look better. At the minute, some of the brush strokes are quite still too uniform. You get some horizontal lines in parallel, things like that. You don't really want that kind of look. You want them all to look sort of random. But as you do more and more layers and paint them from different angles, they'll overlap and eventually it'll all blend together. And you can see now as well, because I'm just using purely Temple Guard Blue, it's looking much more blue obviously, whereas on the first layer when I applied it, the transparency was sucking away some of the colour, but also obviously mixing it with the German Grey was desaturating it as well. So here you can see a bit more how I mentioned I want the ends of the tendrils to be lighter, for those reasons that I specified, being high contrast against the rest of the leather cloak. So it's quite important when you're applying the paint to have it to apply it in thin layers. If you look when I put the paintbrush into the paint on the wet palette, that I'm only just doing the tip of the paintbrush in there, because this is so many layers. You really run the risk of building up too much paint on the model, so it has to be very, very thin layers when it's applied. The paint on the palette is around about 50-50 water to paint. You have to kind of judge it on each paint though, because things like the German Grey, that actually needs more water because it's a much thicker paint, whereas the Temple Guard Blue, that doesn't quite need as much water. And again with the Morrow White, that is roughly 50-50, but again it's kind of, you have to experiment a little bit for yourself. So test the paint on your thumb or on a spare model or anything, just to see the kind of mark it leaves. If it leaves a thick mark, you've obviously got the paint too thick, or you're applying too much of it. Both can achieve the same sort of effect, although if the paint is watered down and you apply too much, what tends to happen is then the water evaporates and it leaves quite a smooth finish, whereas if the paint is too thick, as it evaporates, there's not as much water to evaporate, so it'll leave a much thicker finish. That's why you're always told to water your paints down, so even if you apply too much, you still don't have that kind of bumpy texture, which really is quite detrimental unless there's a good reason for doing it. And in some cases there are. If you want to get especially rust techniques and things like that, you might want to get really thick textured paint down. But in this case, you really want to make sure that it's thin paint, but not so thin that you're doing glaze or a wash. Particularly a wash. A wash is the opposite of what you want, because the wash will run into the crevices on the hood. Not your crevices, that would be bad. But yeah, the crevices on the hood are the shadow area. They need to be quite dark. They will be glazed over to be darker anyway, because those will then be glazed with red, and then the red will then contrast against and stand out in the darker areas. On the wet palette there, I just added some black. I put down Vallejo model colour black. You can use any black you like. It's just for deeper shading and things like that. So now I'm using a finer brush again. This isn't the same brush that I've just been applying all the paint with. This is size 0 Artist Opus brush, I think. It's either a 1 or a 0. It doesn't matter too much anyway. But as you can see, the point's much cleaner than on the previous brush that was very rough looking. So that was a brush that I'd worn out. So what I'm doing here is applying much more controlled texture effects. Now it's not the final texture effect, there's going to be a lot more in the way of layers and textures. You can see I haven't even touched the blue and white mixture, or indeed the white. The white will be used very sparingly towards the end, and even then probably get glazed down a bit. But in this case it's just to really focus on the details on the model. So now I'm going into the blue and white mixture, and you'll see it's highlighting the areas that are already picked out as the important highlight edged areas, or not just edged, but you know, the lumps on the model that need more highlight. Now this, you can see how the brush touches the model. It's a completely different technique to how the original paint was added. These are much smaller marks in a much tighter area, and so it's making the texture really fine. But again, it's still paying attention to where the paint was applied originally. So it's kind of basically a refining technique. You can see here, so on top of his head, it's not that easy to make out in the video, but he has these spikes coming out of the top of his head, and they're bursting through the hood. And obviously someone's done a bit of a patchwork job to staple the hood together again. But so what that has resulted in is there's lots of torn kind of material that's kind of held together, and so all those edges need to be picked out. One, because it helps with the definition of the detail, so you can just actually see what's going on. You don't always want to paint things to be super realistic, because depending on lighting, they can hide details, and then if you can't see the details, then it kind of it doesn't look as good. So it's a balance between what looks good and what's realistic. Always paying attention to things like contrast and lighting. So you can see there at the front of the hood, the text is starting to come in a lot more clearly now. But it is quite a slow process because all these textures have to be painted by hand. The reason for that is it gives you much more control over how they look. Now, if you wanted a very, very quick way of doing this, you could perhaps use a sponge or stipple with a big round stiff brush. It won't give you the exact same look. You don't have anywhere near as much control over the paint density and all sorts of things like that. I mean, and picking out the edges and things. But you could very quickly build up the layers and glaze them down, and then just pick out some final highlights at the end, and that would give a sort of similar result and would perhaps work for tabletop gaming and things like that. But in this case, I'm doing this to display level standard. So what I'm doing is you can keep seeing that I'm going back, applying more paint over the areas I've already worked on. So I'm applying these textures, and then in a chaotically controlled way, and then I'm looking for for marks that I've made that are now showing through the different layers, and then trying to make those marks into something interesting on the hood. So you can see there's like larger areas that are kind of like dimples and things. Those will represent imperfections in the material. So then you pick out the lower edges and things like that, and then that works as like texture and again weathered marks on the material. So also when I'm applying these marks, you can see there are folds in the cloth. I'm trying to keep them softly rounded while still being highlighted. They will be again tweaked as the process goes along and things get glazed down and all sorts of things like that, but you have to reinforce the shape of the material and what would be the structure underneath it, just to make it sure it looks three-dimensional. If you just painted this flat black and then went and edge highlighted everything on it, including all the details on the hood as well, like the cracks and things, once you've finished edge highlighting it doesn't have any depth, it just is edge highlighted. So this technique gives it a lot of body, lots of depth, and just makes it look more three-dimensional. And it also means you can play around with the lighting a bit more, just to, again, focus your eyes onto areas that you want. Because I'm making the hood quite, although it's a dark colour, so we'll say it's black, although it's obviously got a lot of, or it will have a lot of colours on it when it's finished. It's still light, and I'm going to be painting the skin on the inside the hood fairly dark, to basically show that it's inside the hood. And also when I paint the eyes, I want them to stand out a little bit, so that will allow me to have a bit of higher contrast when I do it. So here you can see I've carried on doing all these textures. Now it's looking really bright at the moment, but also I think quite interesting. Depending on the colours that you wanted to go for, you can actually start glazing it grey at this stage to blend things in, and then just keep the black areas just at some gentle glazing just to blend everything together. Because what you might see is that the textures look very harsh, but some of that is down to the video as well. I try to explain this every now and then in the videos, but because of the very bright light and the way the camera works, it makes things look higher contrast than they are. You get this in lots of people's videos and photographs online in general, and it's part of the reason why non-metallics work so well in photographs. But what it's doing in this case is that it's really pushing the highlights and really shading the shadow, but that makes the texture stand out more than it does when you look at it in the flesh. So while some of these marks look very harsh in the video, in reality they're quite subtle. Having said all that, it's still quite important, especially if you're doing non-metallics and things like that, to really push that contrast. So in some cases it might look overly high contrasted in photos and videos, but when you look at it in real life, the contrast looks correct. It's just a little bit, because of the media, the way you view things, they will always look a little bit different. You'll find this as well when people photograph models with black backgrounds. The black backgrounds really push the contrast of the contrast in general overall, and it will make all the highlight parts seem really bright. Now if you obviously saw that in the flesh, that wouldn't happen. But I mean, it displays the model really nicely, and that's why a lot of people use black backgrounds. And I do it myself sometimes. The problem with using a black background as well is that it can push the contrast too high, and then it looks too extreme. And you're not changing the colour of the model, you're changing the way that the colours are shown, if that makes sense. But anyway, that was a long-winded explanation as to why on the image that you can see there, the textures stand out really strongly. And that's also why when you see the photographs that I post at the end of the videos, so you can see the results, those are more in keeping with the image that I've painted, whereas in the video when you see the really dark areas, so some of it is down to, with the light being directly on top, it's picking out the whites, making them bright, but anything in shadow is then made to look darker. But anyway, I think you get the idea. So you might find as well, when doing this, that you start adding texture and you kind of lose the thread of where you're going with the texture, and it's quite easy to do this because you just get into kind of the zone where you're just applying the texture and applying the texture, and you do more layers because there's so much of it that you have to do, and you lose your overall focus. So I'd strongly recommend once you've been doing it for a little while, to stop, put the thing down and just look at it from a distance and decide, have I added too much texture? Does the shape still work, or have I gone completely overboard and hidden some of the details on the model? Does it need to be softened down and things? Having said all that, remember that it's still got to be glazed down, so areas will be softened down anyway. Don't worry too much about overglazing it, because again you can just pick out some of those details again. And what's really nice is when you glaze over some of these details, then you can then pick them out again with a very small amount of paint, and it'll add even more detail and depth to those textures, making them look kind of three-dimensional again. But I will be going into more details with other videos, looking at the rest of the cloak on the model. But what you will find is, because of this technique, now obviously I'm painting quite quickly because I know what I'm doing, and if you're doing this for the first time, you might want to take your time a bit more just to make sure that you're getting the textures and things in the right place and you're not just making a mess. But having said that, even with me doing it on the cloak is such a large area because he's a really big model. It's taken me a long time to put all this texture down, so hopefully it'll be worth it in the end. And for other painters that I can imagine, they could take even longer as well. Some people say, like David Soper, he does amazing controlled, detailed textures on his pieces. I could only imagine how long that would take if you used that technique to cover a model this size, but it would look absolutely amazing. So there you can see, now I think it stands out much more clearly that you can see the long tendrils that come down from the hood, how they're much lighter at the end, and then it goes up, kind of like a transition, so you're making a transition with the textures rather than blending paints together. So here I'm going to be making a glaze. This is Abaddon black. See, just a small amount of black paint, and then probably it's something like 5 drops of water, maybe more, to 1 drop of paint. And here I'm using it's Evil Sun's Scarlet. Actually, this one's Mephiston Red, but I use both reds. It doesn't actually matter too much which red you use, because it's only to add a slight tint to the colour, to the shadows and things like that. So if you've only got Evil Sun's Scarlet, sorry, that's fine. If you've only got Mephiston Red, that's fine. It won't make a massive difference to it. But if you want to get some of those reds brighter, then you will need the Evil Sun Scarlet. But in that case, I've waffled on, and it's those reds are actually, it is just Mephiston Red at this stage. So here I am glazing on the Abaddon black. Now this does a few things. So even though I went on that long discussion on how the textures appear really strong in comparison to how you'd see it in the flesh, they do actually still stand out a little bit, and this is where the glazing comes in. And I'm glazing into the shadows all the time. So if you see, I'm going from the highlight area towards the shadow using the side tip, the side of the tip of the brush, and as much of the side as I can fit on the model. But I've explained this in plenty of videos now, but I'll go over it again anyway. What happens is, when you apply the glaze, you start near the highlight and you go into the shadows, because when you take the brush off of the model, more paint is left due to surface tension where the brush leaves the model than where it first applies it. Now that's not true if you overload the brush and you don't clean off the take off the excess glaze, because if you completely load it up so there's like a drip on the end of the brush, as soon as you touch the model it's going to flood the whole area. But in this case you glaze towards the shadows because you control the paint as it's applied. And it's quite a slow process. You'll slowly start to see things change, but it's dulling down all the textures, especially those textures within the shadows, because those are the ones that stand out the most. The darker the area, when you apply the texture on top, the stronger the contrast will be. So here you can see I've done quite a bit of glazing on it now, so we're going to go into the Mephiston Red. Exactly the same process, glazing in towards the shadow area. This will actually take away the shadows a little bit in those areas. If you just want to keep the material to be black or like kind of bluey, because I've obviously used black in the textures, then you don't need to use the red on if you don't want to. But it's just so that I can get some more interest and a bit more colour on the model. And part of that is down to the green armour that I've got on the model as well, so the red will work nicely with that. If you're not sure what I'm talking about when I say the green on the model, if you check the other videos, there are tagged as Mortarion. You'll see that there is I think there's at least one video anyway, showing how I've painted the armour on him with the nice green effect. There will be more videos as well. I've got quite a lot to do on Mortarion, so you can look forward to all the interesting details and things. So as you can see, as you build up the layers, you keep going over and over, and it makes the colour stronger. What you have to do is really pay attention to not keep glazing, because what I find anyway is that glazing is quite fun. You can go really wild with the brush stroke. You're not going to make strong marks. It's not going to destroy anything in one mark. So if you make a mistake, you'll barely even see it. And all the time you're applying these glazes, it's softening things, and it kind of makes things look more refined. So you kind of get into the zone again where you're just applying glaze after glaze, and you think, wow, especially because you don't see results straight away. You might think, oh, I just got to keep glazing. But again, it's that thing where you've got to stop once you've done a little bit, put it down, look at it, really pay attention. Have I glazed too much? So if that's the case, stop, or just look for where you need to add more colours. Now on this, you can see where the red goes on, where it's closer to the highlight. That makes it much more pinky, whereas as it goes into the darker areas, it's sort of just a deeper red edging towards sort of purple. But the purple is also reinforced by, obviously, where the red goes over the textures that have got blue in. So there's quite a lot of colour variance that's coming in here just by adding this red glaze. But so don't forget, you can keep glazing over all these areas, especially the highlight areas. You can glaze over them. It'll dull them right down, but the marks are still there. Unless you glaze too much, like I said, and then it becomes opaque, and then you've just completely wiped out all your work. But before it becomes opaque, you've still got all these textures showing through, but they just get softer and softer and more refined. So they get to a stage where it would be very hard to make an equivalent brush mark without having the glazing technique. So it looks more impressive than it actually is, just because you've got these very soft marks showing through. People might think, wow, that's amazing, how would you do a markup like that? And it's because it was a very hard, rough mark that you just glazed over it, so it becomes like semi-invisible, and it looks really refined. So for this video, it's not just going to be the hood, it's going to be the whole of the head, but it's a two-part video. So in this video I am looking mainly at the material on the head. I keep going to say it's leather, but it's because of the colours. It can be whatever material you want it to be, but it's more towards a leather kind of texture. You can see the that sort of worn look. So here we are, where I've reworked over the top. I've gone over, made sure I've got these textures all over the piece now. So it's just exactly the same technique you've seen, and you can see like a more finished result. So from here on in the video, we're going to be looking more at the skin. But what this will also do is show how it it'll make the leather look different. Already you can see by just applying this colour inside the hood, it tones down the contrast between the face, everything within the hood basically, and the hood itself. Because before it was just completely black, and that made the light highlights all the way around it super high contrast. Whereas now, because the skin colour is lighter than black, obviously, it's now reduced that contrast. On the wet palette, there's 3 colours that I've added that I'm going to be working with on, well, actually 4 colours, sorry, that I'm going to be working with on the skin a little bit. Clean Flesh Tone, Rhinox Hide, Xereus Purple, and Kislev Flesh. They're quite common colours. I use them a lot for other flesh tones, but in the case of this one, he's going to have a slightly rotten kind of face. Obviously he's Mortarion Primarch of Nurgle, so you can't have a fresh, healthy looking skin tone. So this is a few layers of paint now that I've applied to the flesh, to the face. What you'll find is with the clean flesh tone, when you're applying it over black, actually if you've seen the previous video that I posted, or the previous 2 videos where I did the Kingdom Death Gladiator, you might remember on that I did a very, very rough airbrush coat of green flesh tone over the black areas, just so it gave me a base to work with when applying the paint, because otherwise you get the result like here, where I've had to paint I think about 4 or 5 layers of green flesh tone just to get a not even a perfectly smooth finish, but a roughly opaque finish to it. So now what I'm doing is I'm mixing in Rhinox hide to the shadow areas. The Rhinox hide isn't quite as watered down as you might think. It's the same, so I was saying it's around about 50-50, something like single cream, but because of the properties of Rhinox hide, it especially over lighter colours, it looks almost like a glaze. It's very transparent, really. But that's quite nice for this result anyway, because it allows me to have more control over where the paint goes in the form of shadows, basically, because that's what I'm using it for. It's just put it in all the details around the eye sockets and the crevices and things like that. Now it's going to be quite hard for you to see really the face in the hood, because there's a hood in the way, and while I'm on the topic, I would recommend, if you possibly can, to paint the face before you put it into the hood. Now there is a problem with that, and I mentioned it at the beginning of the video. The hood comes in 2 parts, and then the face goes inside that, and the problem with that is, if you've painted the face, then you have to glue it within the hood and put the big long tendril section that goes over the front and clips onto the back of the hood where the face rests in. But you then get this big gap that goes all the way around over the top of the head in line with the spikes that come through the hood, which means that you then have to fill that and sand it down, which means you risk damaging the paintwork, which is basically why I glued it all together and sanded it down before painting. But because of that, it's much harder to paint the face. Now it's quite a big face in comparison to, say, a 28mm model. I mean, I know it's 28mm scale, but he's a Primarch, he's massive. But the problem is you're restricted in your movements, so you can't do long brush strokes. You have to rely on just using the tip of the brush. You can't use the side of the brush for anything, because it will catch on the hood, which I've already painted. I suppose the smart thing to do would be to paint the flesh first before painting the hood, because then you don't have to worry about catching the already painted areas. But I didn't, so that's why I'm giving you this advice. But again, because of the techniques that I use on the hood, which are very rough, then you would risk getting paint on the face, and because it's easier to paint the hood than it is the face, I painted the hood first, so I can repair any damage on paint that gets on that, rather than if I did it the other way around and I spent a long time doing the face and then get some paint on it, and then you're going to be like, that's really annoying. So after I'd painted all the Rhinox hide in here with all the shadows, I'm going back over using green flesh tone again just to pick out all the details. I should warn you as well, the details on the face are very, very fine. There's lots of stretched skin and folds on there. It's not like a normal face, obviously. He's a demon Primarch of Nurgle, but you have to be quite careful how you do this. Now, I've got some of the shadows quite dark in there, So what's going to happen is actually that you're going to get a super high contrast. I say that too much really, but you're getting a high contrast between the Rhinox hide and the Cadian flesh tone, because it just is, the tone is really different. So you can see there it looks really dark on all of the details, which can be quite nice, but I don't want them to be that stronger contrast. So what you'll see is later on I'll be glazing over it a little bit and just toning down some of these shadowed lines. Again, I'm just using the tip of the brush as much as I can and applying the paint very carefully, just in super small amounts. Here I'm picking out the eyelid under the eye. There are eyelids in both eyes. The eye on the right, his left eye, but the right, as we look at it, it has different details around it, and it also has these a couple of boils on it and things like that, which makes it even harder to paint the eyelid underneath. I'm not sure if they're called eyelids now. The bit the bit of the eye that moves and that closes your eyes anyway, that goes at the bottom. Because it's a line that goes underneath it anyway, and it kind of helps to define the shape of the eye at the bottom. And because of those boils, or whatever they are underneath there, you can't run the brush along that section to pick them out. So again, you just have to use the tip and actually paint them in, which it's a bit more tricky. So here you can see where I'm going into using the Kislev flesh. Again, this will really push the contrast, but it works as a highlight, and I wanted more. Well, I wanted some of the bigger areas to be able to stand out, especially more towards the centre of the face, whereas the edges of the hood are darker, going to the shadows. You can see when I put the brush in the paint there, it's a very, very small amount of paint that I apply to the brush. There I am, just highlighting that lower eyelid. This is a better angle for you to see. As I mentioned, it's a little bit tricky for me to paint this so you can see exactly what I'm doing, because again, the face is in the hood, so it gets hidden quite a lot. On the subject of his faces, actually, the model comes with two different faces. There's this one that I'm using, and then another one that is almost identical, but his left eye, but right as we look at it on the screen, is kind of winking or something like that. I couldn't quite figure it out, but I didn't like it. I've not seen anyone else use it either, so I'm guessing people just generally think the same as I do and prefer to have two round eyes. I wanted the two round eyes basically so that I could paint eyes, two separate eyes, because the eyes will match the wings for different colours. And that will be really tricky if one of the eyes was winking. So there you can see roughly the two eyes in there, and the highlights, how they've been painted more in the centre. But also you can see what I was talking about when I was saying by having the Rhinox hide in all the lines, it's made the contrast basically too high at the moment. but it has allowed me to pick out all the details, so I can now clearly see where everything is. So here I'm using the Xereus purple. This is to get some colour in, make the flesh look more kind of disease-ridden. What's kind of nice as well is if you mix the purple and the brown, you get a very dark colour that's borderline black. So you can use this one with the purple goes a little bit over the Cadian flesh tone and the Kislev flesh. That makes it quite a bright purple. But then as it goes into the shadows of the Rhinox hide, it makes it look really dark as well. So this is Balor brown, and what I'm doing is painting in the some of the little boils on there. I actually later on in the next video you'll see I'm going to change the colour of these so they become bright yellow. I was going for a more subtle look at this stage, so the Balor brown. You'll see them painted here, then you'll see them again in the second video, so it'll be up to you which you prefer. I just decided that I wanted them a brighter yellow just so that they stand out for a bit more high contrast. You can see I also put some neutral grey on there. No, sorry, not neutral grey. That's actually Skaven Blight Dinge. So I was going to just put a little bit of grey in the skin tone, just to make it look more dead. But I'm not sure in this video how much I actually get done it because I've recorded it all in one go. So it might be on the next video that you see that. What you'll also notice here as I'm applying the colours and things is I keep going backwards and forwards, so I'll apply some highlights and apply some colours, and I'll probably go back with some Rhinox hide or Xereus purple and go over them again, and it just kind of blends things together. It does multiple layers because of the transparency of the paint, just in the same way as all the textures become more subtle and things on the hood. It does the same on the flesh, so you can paint in details, glaze over them, then they become softer, then you can pick out areas, and it just gives you more control. Excuse the beep, that's just a message for me. Actually, I'm going to correct myself a third time. The grey was heavy blue grey from Vallejo. That's the base colour for the eyes. Because I'm doing the voiceover, I was trying to remember what order I do things, so it's in the next video that you get the grey on the skin. This is just to paint in the eyeballs. The reason for that is, again, it works as a base colour, so it will affect the tone of the skin around it, because you're dropping the contrast. Because the eyes were so black and you were painting on skin, that was making the eyes really dark and making the skin really light. By painting in the eyeballs light, it's reduced that range of contrast. So that's it for this video. There's that image is a little bit further along. That'll be discussed more in the next video, but you get a general idea anyway. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.